Alrighty, what is up, beautiful people? Got another awesome author interview for you today, and today's author is Miss MJ Vieira. MJ is the author of the Veritas book series and the Manjian Chronicles. The second book in the Manjian Chronicles, FIREBIRD, was just released in April of this year. Born and raised in Maine, MJ now lives in Missouri with her husband, son, and their Saint Bernard named Roxy. While traveling, she read many great authors, including Tolkien, Stephen King, C.S. Lewis, and Anne Rice. It is from these writers, combined with the power of music, mainly hard rock and folk, that MJ draws her inspiration. This was honestly a fantastic author interview. For Shalini and I, this is one of the most memorable ones. We talked about so many different things. We got deep into vampires, into writing styles. We even touched upon some of the more difficult subjects that are brought up in MJ's works. And I think it was a good reminder that, fantasy, while it's very fun and grand and beautiful and poetic, it's really at the core of many of the stories are very real and troubling issues. And MJ addresses them in a very genuine way and clearly a very deep thinker as well. So hopefully you enjoy it as much as we did, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So without further ado, we give you Miss MJ Vieira. Hey folks, so here we are with MJ Vieira. Thank you again, MJ, for coming onto the podcast. Please describe a little bit about your writing and the Manjian Chronicles.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. That's probably one of the hardest questions in my mind is to try to describe my writing, so I'll do this I can. I typically write very dark paranormal fantasy stories. I tend to deal with a lot of topics a lot of people don't like to hear about, like domestic violence and things along those natures. But the Manjian Chronicles tends to be is more of a high fantasy novel. So it's war against two races of people that are not on this world. So it's a completely different, world on itself. And you have the Vampire Nation and the Manjians, who are a group of wizarding, basically, peoples. They have a very, very tense peace at the moment, but that's all about to erupt. And at the end of FIREBIRD, you kind of see that come to a head. I draw a lot from Tolkien on this series. That's my main inspiration for the series. However, these characters have been in my mind for a very long time. FIREBIRD centers around the Manjians, and Arashi and Sita are two siblings that find themselves thrown into a palace coup. And Arashi actually controls the weather. His name's actually from the Japanese kanji Arashi for storm. Sita is more of a old school kind of witchy type character. And you find out later that Sita's actually been kind of dabbling with some dark magic, and a character named Ol comes out who's actually the Sandman. So I drew a lot of different inspiration for the series, but I can't wait to write the next segment because it's basically going to be a huge war, and they're all going to have to find peace with the races that neither of them thought they would.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of interesting stuff. Like, I don't know where to begin with the questions. There's so many cool things there.
There's really a lot there, but you definitely you seem to really have put so much thought into this world, and you said that you've had these characters in your mind for a long time.
I started writing Arashi and Sita back when I was a teenager.
Oh wow!
And Ol is new, so I've got two very old characters that I feel like I've known forever, and then this other very powerful one that I'm kind of like, I don't know what to do with you yet, but here we go. So yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from there.
It's always an interesting thing, like for writers, because we always have this weird sort of multiple perspectives in our head where just something happens, we have an experience or something just happens over time, and all of a sudden there's like another voice in our head that's speaking, and we can write out what they're saying. So it's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure readers understand this, and it's going to kind of come out in a funny way, but I feel like we're just kind of the vessels sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't know where the story's really going, and the more you try to steer it in one direction, it never works that way, I find. So I just tend to kind of let it go the way it's going to go and enjoy the ride best I can.
Yeah. So are you more of a gardener rather than an architect? I feel like we ask this of every author we interview, but it's kind of like a standard question.
I'd say I'm kind of both, if that gives you, I know that's like non-committal, but I tend to have an idea of where it's going, but then, yeah, I just kind of go with the flow. I try to outline, and I usually have a rough idea, but then it ends up halfway through. I'm like, oh, no, that's not what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Then scratching half out and rewriting it.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds me of how, even for Tolkien, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, he thought the main plot was just going to be Frodo and Sam and the ring, and then all of a sudden, like, this mysterious ranger comes into the mix, and then it kind of branches off into this. Sorry,
I'm so glad Aragorn was not into it initially, because he's honestly one of my favorite characters of the series.
Oh yeah.
So.
Sure. Yeah, he's just like such an admirable sort of character. It's hard not to root for the guy.
Right, but I mean, he's got his own little turmoil going on. He's not so one-dimensional that you're kind of like, okay, he's like the knight in shining armor kind of, but it's a little rusted. But you find out so much more about him, and I think I really, any series I read, if a character development isn't there, I lose interest so quick.
Yeah.
So.
For sure. So you mentioned earlier that you usually bring in topics that are hard to talk about in your works, especially in your other sort of, it's a romantic fantasy. What would you call it? The Veritas series?
Oh, there is romance in it, but I would call it more of a paranormal thriller.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
The love is definitely in there, but it's not a good love.
Okay.
I'd say it's kind of a toxic.
Right.
So in the Veritas series, Jade is trying to figure out who she is and what's going on in the world around her, because she wakes up in a totally different world. And the person she thinks that she should be following and trusting, Malum, is actually, you find out later, not a very wholesome individual, we'll put it that way.
Right. Interesting.
That's putting it lightly.
Yeah. So, yeah, just going back to that whole kind of hard to talk about issues like domestic violence, which I'm guessing is in this series. Did you kind of have that sort of blueprint for the Manjian Chronicles as well? Is there topics that you think are hard to talk about that you explore in high fantasy?
I think in the Manjian Chronicles, I try really hard not to get political in my writing at all, because I just, to me, that's not a good platform to try to get your ideas across. However, I think the big thing with the Manjian Chronicles is you have the vampires and you have the Manjians, and they're two very hate-filled races towards each other. I mean, they've got this, pseudo peace, but it's nothing that's real. And I think deeper in the series, they have to put all those prejudices aside and, move on from that. They got this deep-rooted fear of each other, and they hate each other, but they really don't have a reason to. They think they do, but they don't.
Right.
So to put aside their hate, Arashi and Sita are going to need the vampires in order to, regain their throne and regain the life that they had. And Io and Jarek have the same issue. They don't, they hate the Manjians. And Io, did you actually read Fireweed?
No, we didn't have the time to do that. It's because we do a lot of author interviews successively. Sure. So
Before no
worries.
I mean, just to be a spoiler a little bit, Io is sexually assaulted. And I don't write it out, but it is in there. So her love for the Manjians is not there at all. But they all need to put that aside in order to get past and regain the common good. So I think that's going to be kind of the big thing there. And I think with everything going on in the world today, it's a hard concept for a lot of people.
Yeah. I think a lot of fantasy is driven by that kind of, different races and trying to work together and putting aside perceived, wrongs and things like that. But it's interesting because I feel like the same people who really dig those kind of stories and, are always like, oh yeah, that's so dumb, they should just work together. They might not see the same sort of parallels in the real world sometimes. But Like you said,
they take the escape.
Yeah, exactly, and they kind of just keep it as an escape. But I mean, as a writer, you can only do so much about it. So,
but just to draw back to the question, I'd say the Manjian Chronicles. That's kind of going to be their biggest, as I see it right now, their biggest hurdle.
Right.
Veritas definitely deals with a few more touchier subjects, but honestly, I didn't really write it intentionally that way. It just kind of happened. Again, the vessel thing. So
nice. I think we'll segue into some more of the magical aspects of the Manjian Chronicles. So this question is coming from like my nerdy plant botanical side of myself. So I work at a botanical gardens, and I'm also doing an English thesis, and I'm writing about ecology as it's portrayed in literature. So I really like reading about plants and things like that. So I was really interested to hear that Fireweed is kind of a book that centers around a plant. Fireweed, the title of the story. And fireweed is is a plant that emerges in a barren land, and then it heralds the doom of the two races in your world. I thought that was interesting that the fireweed was the catalyst for the story. What was the inspiration behind using a plant? Did you consciously do that, or was it? Do you think it was something that you picked up from Tolkien, because he uses a lot of plants in his world building and parts of his plots and things like that? So
I really liked that question when you sent it over, because honestly, it's not something I really thought about very deeply. I wrote the prologue for Fireweed, frankly, because a friend of mine's like, you need to get something out there. You need to get another story out there. You've been working on Veritas. I was at a real block, and I was getting really frustrated. And she's like, you need to do something completely different. So just sit down and write something. And I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I was just thinking about how fire cleanses, even though it destroys. And, a lot of times you don't see much vegetation pop up. But in Maine especially, there is a plant we call fireweed. Oh. Now, what it is, I don't know. I know there's probably a very scientific term, and people out there probably I do. But we all call it fireweed, and it always pops up after a wildfire hits, an area, and it looks exactly like the cover. I actually had an artist do that. So that was just kind of my trigger for it. And one thing that's always fascinated me about societies is you look back in history, and we're always trying to figure out what someone meant by a symbol. I mean, we think it means one thing, but in reality, back when they drew it, it could mean something totally different. So in this prophecy, they're saying that the fireweed brings doom, but is that really the case? I mean, yeah, it brings change, but does that mean destruction?
Right.
So that's where I was more going from it. However, once you brought in the Tolkien aspect of it, I kind of had to sit back and go, well, is that where some of this came from? And, you're absolutely right. Tolkien uses plants as a major concept in a lot of his stories. So I don't know if I was conscious. I wasn't consciously doing it, I should say. I don't know if I was subconsciously doing it, but it is a good parallel. And it was one I thought was really neat you brought up.
Yeah, I recently was gifted, what was it? The Plants of Middle-earth. And it's like this big hardcover book. And it talks about the 160 different real and fantastical plant species that are in Tolkien. And it just gets so nerdy, and it has all these maps and drawings, and it's great. But yeah, I guess I was drawing from that when I was thinking about fireweed as well. It's also neat that you had like a real world basis for the fireweed as well, that it was something that caught your eye in your own state. And I feel like that's also very Tolkienish too, because he was writing his England, right? The Shire is like where he grew up. So
I think you can draw for any story from real life experiences. There's so much going on out in the world. You just got to kind of stop and look. You usually find something to draw inspiration from out there.
Yeah, totally. And along those lines, earlier when we were doing, we were introing you, we noted music is a really big part of your life and your writing. So can you tell us a bit, MJ, how music plays into how you write, and is there something specific about hard rock and folk that are conducive to the fantasy that you write?
Music's always been a big thing from childhood. My dad is very music oriented, so he kind of passed that along to me. And I don't know, ever since I was a little kid, we took long road trips and I would just listen to music. I'd have my Walkman at the time or my CD player, and I would stare out the window and I'd have these songs playing, and I would just be in a whole nother world, envisioning a scene to this song. And it just has kind of kept me going in my writing. I have playlists for each character, each scene, different worlds, hard rock. I don't really use hard rock quite as much in Manjian as I do Veritas, but I use a lot of Viking metal, actually.
Oh, cool.
In Manjian, and then I use a lot of Celtic kind of folk, but I also use some American folk. It kind of depends on what I'm going for, the mood. And it never ceases to amaze me that I can hear a song and, you know, all of a sudden I'll associate it with a character and I'll be like, oh my God, this is great. And I'll have to figure it out who it is, add it to the playlist. And I mean, I wrote a whole scene in Veritas to Amber Run's, I think it's I Found or something along those lines, but I just had it on loop, the whole scene, and I wrote it out in about 10 minutes. So it just seems to trigger something in me and the imagination goes and I just kind of go with it.
Yeah, I listen to music too when I write sometimes, and for some of the more violent scenes, I've listened to Mongolian folk metal, which yeah, it's pretty badass stuff, and I've had it before too, where I also like I'll loop it because there's just a feeling that is captured, you know, whether it's in the chorus or there's a bridge that's really awesome, and I picture almost what I'm writing kind of like a movie scene. And then that's the music that they've used for the cut of that scene.
Yeah.
And that's a really effective way to write. I'm surprised. I think you're one of the only people that has really brought that up. I mean, some others I think we've spoken to do talk about using music, but not in this like very specific fashion. MJ, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know a lot of. I know a lot of fans as well think they like having, you know, extra content from writers, and then they like getting, you know, the Spotify playlists of the author's sort of music while they were listening to what they were listening to while they were writing the scenes. I don't know if you do that at all, like kind of share those playlists as well.
Actually, I had someone ask me if I was going to do that for the Veritas series, and it's something I'm working on.
Yeah.
She's like, it'd be really cool to have the whole playlist set while I'm reading it because it would make that experience deeper. And it was never something I'd really thought about because, you know, it's not that it's private, but like you said, a lot of people don't do it. And sometimes I get worried they're going to be like, wow, you're a nutcase.
Yeah.
I want to know what I was listening to, what I was writing.
It definitely could
but
backfire.
I'm going to work on it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think it's definitely a niche sort of thing. Like I see it a lot on Tumblr and things like that with the young kids these days. But yeah, I mean, it's really cool how you can share different art forms and kind of they intermingle, and you can kind of connect in multiple ways with your fans and readers and things like that through not just your writing, but the inspiration that you heard.
It makes it much more personable, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if there's also something about music and, you know, the structure of music, because, like, you know, for studying, like, sometimes it works for people and sometimes it doesn't, but for students who listen to music, they can really, like, focus in and study on what their subject is. And I'm wondering if that's the kind of same rhythm that helps us kind of write and puts us in a sort of more focused, creative mood.
Yeah, that might be. I mean, most music's written a lot like a book is. There's their beginning, middle, end, and I think that helps. And I definitely, like I said, I have certain, like Peter Gabriel, which is, I know isn't metal or anything, but I write a lot to Peter Gabriel. The intro to FIREBIRD was actually from his Red Rain song, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with at all, but I don't know, it's certain things just set it off and I go with it at this point. I don't fight it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, whatever works, right?
Yeah. So MJ, speaking about where you are in terms of genre, you do describe yourself as a paranormal fantasy and horror writer. And do you find that the two genres blend into each other when you write a new story, or do you set out from the start with a set genre and stick to it?
Honestly, Veritas just kind of started out as I didn't even know where it was going. and it ended up being paranormal thriller to me, so I just kept it like that. Manjian Chronicles, I set out for a fantasy, because, like I said, I'd written Arashi and Sita for a long time. I had their world really developed. I really just had to work on the vampire side, and I created a pantheon for, the whole world, and then went that way. And once I knew that's where I was going, that's where I was headed. I add the horror in there. I have a short story called Route 201 that takes place in Maine that is a horror story, and I did set out to write a horror story. But a lot of times to be honest with you, I have a really hard time even categorizing what I write sometimes. I'm like, I had someone read Lux, and they're like, I don't even know what to call this, if it's paranormal thriller or dark fantasy, or, because there's just so many things included. But I am trying to keep the Manjian Chronicles high fantasy. That's my goal. So I do have a couple beta readers I've told, if I look like I'm straying, please set me on track, because I don't want to mix them as much. However, Veritas and Route 201, I think those two kind of blend a bit because it's all paranormal. If that makes sense. To me, ghosts are paranormal, but what makes it a horror, I think, is just the sheer terror of some of the situations. But Veritas kind of handles some of that too. So I don't know if I really answered it very well, but I try very hard to stick with what I'm writing when I know where I'm going with it. I think that's just part of the trick with me, is figuring out where I'm going.
Yeah, and I think paranormal as a genre it lends itself to being really malleable. Like, you can do a lot of stuff with it too. With high fantasy, it's a bit more of a rigid structure. Obviously, you can do a whole bunch of stuff with it, but yeah, paranormal, it's like, I mean, it could be set in the real world. It can be set in like a semi-real world. It could be fantasy. It could just be like anything you want it to be.
It's kind of hard to pin it down, I feel.
Yeah, and the same with horror too. Like, I feel like between science fiction, fantasy, and horror, there's so much intermingling to begin with. So I'm always interested to talk to writers who think of themselves in different genres, and they're not just in one genre necessarily, and their mind kind of works in different ways, I guess. And they have to switch gears in between genres. And
I think, unfortunately, if they can be a fantasy writer and that's all they write, more power to them. But I also feel that you get, like any actor, you can get typecasted, and to that point where you try to branch out into something else, and someone's like, well, I'm not going to read that. You should be only writing your fantasy stuff. Well, I write whatever I want to write, and hopefully people enjoy it, but I don't want to get pigeonholed into something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I enjoy all kinds of genres. I read everything from crime novels to history fiction. So if I want to try it, I'm going to try it. It may not turn out really well. I may not publish it, but I'm going to try it. So I think in publishing on Amazon, especially when they ask you what is this, and I sit there and I look at it for a good 10 minutes. I don't know. What do I call this?
Yeah, sometimes it's all good and well to, like, just go with the flow and write for fun, and then you have to, like, sit down and think about the realities and the logistics of writing, and you're like, I have to, like, pigeonhole myself now, like, consciously. This is kind of counterintuitive in a way.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think it can be.
Yeah.
Market-wise, you have to, but it is very difficult, I feel. Yeah,
for sure. Speaking of markets and paranormal, so vampires. So obviously vampires are kind of a staple in paranormal fantasy. I mean, Twilight kind of blew up the archetype again, but
the best movies ever.
Yeah, Morgan loves those movies.
Oh, jeez.
He watched like 10 minutes of the last movie, and he made up his mind from that. But anyway, but I mean, even before that, Anne Rice, Octavia Butler, and many others going back, centuries. Yeah. So your vampires, though, are not kind of the contemporary vampires, because they're set in a sort of high fantasy world. So I was just interested to ask, why did you choose vampires as a race in fantasy, like in a high fantasy setting, when they're normally kind of in a paranormal setting? Was this again sort of genre bending kind of not tactic, but a thing that you kind of just did because you're thinking in multiple genres?
That's a good question, and as we spoke about earlier, it's kind of one that stumped me for a minute because you're absolutely right, but I never really thought of it that way. Vampires are typically your paranormal and set in either Victorian time or now.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not in a high fantasy world, and I had to do some thinking on that, and I really feel that part of it, when I set it up the way I did, was most people see vampires as dead. They're dead creatures that come back by either demonic or, if you want to say it's a disease, whatever story you're reading that looks at it that way. And the Manjians are full of life. They're full of magic. It's kind of like witches versus vampires type of thing, I guess you could say. But my vampires aren't totally dead. They simply are lacking the magic that they had at one point.
Interesting.
So to me, I think it's a counterbalance type of thing. I'm always about balance, yin and yang, in my stories. So you've got the Manjians who have all their magic and their light, and they're just alive. And then you get the vampire culture that is actually dying in the book before Io shows up. And that's where I was coming in with change and all that. They see it as doom when really it's change, and it may be for the good because their way of life is dying. Their offspring are dying. They actually can have live children, but they've had less and less each year. So to me, if you've got two races, what's one going to envy over the other? Well, their ability to flourish. And the vampires hate the Mangians for that. They see it as, they had a duel between the two gods, and their champion lost. So they lost their magic.
Right.
So they hate the Mangians simply for that fact. And the Mangians hate the vampires because they're scared of them. Really, when you get right down to it. So to me, if you need a balance, vampires are the perfect balance in my mind because they feed on blood. They're dead. People don't like what they don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I honestly think I just kind of went for vampires because I've always loved them as a kid. They're my favorite. Lost Boys is my favorite vampire movie. Sorry, but
Yeah.
I love the Twilights.
Yeah.
Read the book, the movies.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's more just kind of a cultural.
I love the Lost Boys.
Yeah.
I've just always wanted to write vampires, but I guess I got, like you said, Twilight blew everything up, and I was kind of like, well, I don't want to write something like Twilight in a new setting and look like I'm just copying Twilight.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was a little bit of strategy, but mainly it was the counterbalance, I'd say. But you're absolutely right. Really, I don't think I really can think of a series with high fantasy vampires.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what, I think it is a pretty brave decision to include them because I think that there are a lot of attempts to write them in a certain way, and it doesn't pan out. And I think, like, my most recent encounter with them that I really, really liked was in video game Skyrim, the Elder Scrolls game. Yeah. There's an expansion where you can either play as a vampire hunter or you can join them. Join the vampires, get all their powers, and I'm like 100% gonna join them. It's like because before they would show up and they'd always be like an enemy. You have to kill them.
Yeah.
And I actually tried both sides of it, and the vampire hunter one was not really that great, despite the fact that I really like movies where the vampires are the enemy and they're being chased down. It's weird seeing it from the opposite point of view, and I was like, oh, it's kind of cool to be a bad guy in this video game and to kind of experience vicariously why their world is so in a way thrilling and eerie and cool. And
Yeah.
It's interesting, like the MJ, that you've included them, but you're doing it in a way where you're wanting to balance out your narrative a little bit.
I had a professor in my undergrad who was really interested in vampires throughout literature, and he was talking about how with Bram Stoker's Dracula, vampires were enemies. And then you kind of, with Anne Rice, you kind of get a more sympathetic vampire. And then with Twilight, they're like a desirable partner, and it's also a bit weird. And so you're like, we're slowly falling in love with this creature that we at first really feared. throughout different myths and in the Victorian period in particular. And so, yeah, this whole sort of evolution of like, we want to vicariously live as the monster now sometimes. And yeah, I really like stories, MJ, that have that sort of dichotomous look at two different sides, and you can kind of see like where the quote unquote bad guys are coming from, and they're usually just misunderstood or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been, it's something my husband makes fun of me about, but I've always loved the bad guys. Like, I want to know why the bad guys are the way they are, because it's extremely rare to have someone just born evil. I mean, that's typically not, I mean, you have it, but it's not what really happens. And so, like, in Veritas especially, I tend to do that duality to see, yes, Malum's evil, yes, Onyx seems evil, but are they really? Like, what? You know, maybe it's your perception. And I think vampires have been a staple for mythology for, I mean, as you know, centuries. I mean, look back, it went to Romania, back to Vlad, and I almost think they went before that, because I think there are some Indian legends that have their own vampire that predate Vlad. So, and I'm a bit of a history geek, and I really like to do the research and dig, and see, I love mythology, so I do a lot of that before I write. And vampires, I think, yeah, in pulp fiction, we've become to romanticize them a bit, but I always think as humans, we tend to do that. If we see something powerful and deadly, we want it.
Wow.
You know, well, I mean, look at how many people have snakes tattooed on them, or, you know, it's like, it's a deadly creature, but we want that. We want to have that power, whether we like to admit it or not.
I've got a colleague who has a scorpion tattooed on her forearm.
Oh, wow.
And I was going, it's a very interesting tattoo. It's like...
Yeah. I have a dragon tattoo. I absolutely love dragons.
Yeah.
But that's part of the appeal to them. They're so powerful, and they're so just... Yeah, you're not going to mess with that. That's why we tend to use them as emblems and logos. And so a vampire, yeah, they're scary, but at the same time, who wouldn't like to be able to do what they can do? Not feed on blood necessarily, but I mean, you know, the power, the quick speed, the abilities. You know, I think we all deep down really want that.
Yeah.
Brought it to a whole nother level, but.
For me, just to jump in, I particularly thought for a while that it's the immortality as well. And same thing with the like going back to bringing Tolkien back into this, like I always do. It's like the elves and Lord of the Rings, is that we really idolize these types of characters or these races rather. Wouldn't it be just awesome if you would live forever, and then you also have all those powers and you know, but there's obviously a great cost to it. I watched a really interesting movie, forgot the name of it, but I think it's on Netflix, and it's like a little indie film, and there's these vampires that are living, like one's living in Michigan, one lives like in somewhere in Africa, and then there's one I think in I forgot the third location, but they've been alive forever, and they're just kind of having like, you know, a midlife crisis, even though they're immortal. But they're kind of they're bored, and you know, instead of drinking from people, like they go to hospitals and they rob the blood from the lab, and you know, they're just jaded and kind of, you know, like,
that's funny.
Yeah, and so. Movie ends up resolving where they go back to drinking people, and they have all these new problems because they're going back to like the old way, so to speak. And I think that there's so many parallels between how people feel with satisfaction in terms of like their work or careers, and the legacy that they're going to leave, and the meaning in their lives, and their
innate abilities as well, because I think humans think, or us, we're humans.
The race that actually exists.
Like we tend to think that if we had this certain power, then we would be able to live a happier life. So like if we had immortality, everything would be so much better. But then like those kind of stories, like that indie movie, it kind of shows you like, no, actually immortality is probably really shitty. Because there's no end.
You're gonna live forever. Everyone you know is gonna die.
Yeah.
and you're gonna basically just be sitting there twiddling your thumbs. Yeah, I don't know if I'd want to live forever, but it's an absolute. You're absolutely right. Like, I mean, like you said, Tolkien brings it up with the elves, and you do. I think people they like the idea of it. They definitely do. I think practicality-wise, it probably wouldn't be as fun as it's made out to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have seen, I mean, I'll admit, one of my guilty pleasures is Vampire Diaries. I think it's...
Oh, yeah. I watched it too, up to season 5.
Yeah, the last season I wasn't a big fan of. I was like, okay, this jumped the shark. But, like, Damon, I love that character just because he's such a jerk, but he's really deep down just a giant baby that is really upset.
Yeah, basically.
And I just laugh about it because I'm like, oh, he's having a temper tantrum. Look at him go.
Yeah.
You know, but you see those multiple sides to all of those characters, and that's my biggest goal in writing is I just want to bring my characters to life, and to do that, you can't have a one-dimensional, you know, he's the good guy, woo, he's the bad guy, boo, like that just doesn't work for me. So
for sure. And I never really thought about looking at symbols as a way to introduce multidimensionality, because I always see symbols as, I guess, what everyone else kind of thinks is sort of like a stationary, it means just this one thing. But in actuality, you're kind of exploring how it changes over time, or how it has multiple dimensions, as if it's an archetype, or you know, like a representative animal, like dragon or something. Yeah, no, that's really awesome.
It's all about perception when you get right down to it. Everyone's perception is different, and you know, if you join one perception and can't see the other side of it, then you're going to be really stuck with wherever you are in life. And that's another thing I think I try to bring out in my writing is you can't be stuck in that rut. There's so many different dimensions to people that you really need to look for that, I guess, is where I'm going with that. And the symbolism is a big thing to me. And I mean, I'll be honest, Dan Brown's, I can't think of the name of it now. Da Vinci Code, there we go.
Yeah.
Yes, I was like, that's right there, it's right there. I read that at, I think I was 15-ish. And, I mean, I'd always seen symbols as really cool anyways. Like, I love constellations. I loved everything about it. But that book kind of brought it to a whole new head to me because I was like, oh, wow. You know, he brought up just some really cool ideas that I just kind of blew my mind at the time. And I think I brought that into my writing as well. And that's kind of something he brought up is that, you know, back in ancient times, a symbol would be seen as one thing. We see it now as something completely different. But that's because of evolution. So, you know, what if you went back in time and looked at the way they were looking at it? You'd be totally like, wait, what? What's happening now?
For sure.
So perception's key, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And it's part of history, right? And I think Dan Brown did a good job of bringing history into like the sexy genre of thriller, and opened up a lot of people to history and to mythology and religion, and looking at different perspectives, as you say. Yeah. Do you write, how many perspectives do you tend to write in? So obviously you probably have at least one in each different race in the Manjian Chronicles. Do you do more than that?
In Veritas, I write from first person pretty much. So I switched to Manjian Chronicles. I think I go in Fireweed. There are 3 different perspectives you see from, but they're third person. You'll see it from Jarek's point of view, Io, and Commander Drake. And then in FIREBIRD, I switch between Sita, Arashi, and Ol. It gets a little confusing for some people, I think, but for me to tell the story, it's kind of how I have to do it. So, like in FIREBIRD, I use different symbols at the head of each chapter to tell people if it was Arashi, Sita, or Ol, because I did have someone say that. They're like, well, I get kind of confused. I'm like, all right, well, let me try to make it cleaner. So that actually helped. But I tend to do it depends on which series, but typically I write 2. I think one kind of leaves you a little stranded a bit, but then if you get into too many, like I said, people kind of get confused.
Yeah.
And I get a little happy with it. I'm like, oh, look at this person's perspective. My friend's like, you need to cut that out. I'm like, but it's so much fun.
Yeah.
No, stop it.
No, yeah.
I get carried away.
There's definitely a sweet spot in it, and it depends on the length of the book and all sorts of different things, and writing style and things like that. Yeah. No.
Yeah, and Manjian Chronicles, the first 2 stories are actually novellas, but the next one is going to be a full length. So Fireweed and Firebird, I felt were very important to show people where I'm coming from before I hit into this big war. It was kind of a prelude.
Right.
So I'm going to combine them in the future and release them as one, but right now they're 2 novellas.
That's pretty cool. I like that you switched like completely different into different sets of characters in the 2 different novellas. I thought that's kind of cool, because I think most people do it where in the sequel they just add more perspectives and take away a couple of perspectives, but that complete changes is quite interesting.
Fireweed is from they happen at the same time, so you just see the flip side of each species, basically.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Cool. Speaking of changing perspectives, so you mentioned in a previous interview with Authors Interview that writing became an escape for you when you were first kind of starting out. Is writing still an escape for you? And how do you find that balance between that feeling of escapism with the realities of being an independent author, which is basically akin to being an entrepreneur these days, with having to do the marketing and pigeonholing yourself and all that kind of stuff. So how do you balance those feelings, and how do you feel about writing now?
It is so hard. I'm just going to say that right now, not to discourage anyone at all to, write it, publish it, but being an indie author and trying to promote and do all these things, it has become very hard, I'm not going to lie. And on top of that, I had a 40-hour week job, so I was trying to do promotion, write, work, family.
Gosh.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of white hair right now. There's a reason for that. Self-induced stress. But right now, I have found a pretty good little groove where I know this is one of your other questions, so I won't try to dive too much into it, but I have like 6 work in progress right now. So I'll cut a chunk of time each day and write in whatever project it is that day. When I first began, like we said, it was an escape. I was dealing with a lot of things that I didn't really know who I was. I didn't know where I was going in life. I felt extremely trapped and upset with myself and just angry at a lot of things. And so back to the music thing, I was actually listening to Skillet. Monster was the song, and I started the prequel or the intro to Lux, and I just wrote it, and it was a way to release all that negative feeling I had, and it was a healthy way to do it. I wasn't lashing out at anyone. I wasn't being cranky on myself. I wasn't doing stupid things. I was just writing and letting it go. It sat there for a good 3 years before I actually started writing, because I sent it to someone who we were just talking, and I was like, yeah, look at this, I wrote this, and she's like, well, you need to keep going. Like, there's more to the story here. We need to know what happens. So that became my escape. When I was getting really frustrated or I felt like I wasn't good enough, I went into that world and I just kind of let it all out. Now it is still an escape, but it's a more controlled escape, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I'm not venting. I'm not as angry. I got through that time in my life. Now it's more, I really want to tell these stories because I enjoy it. But balancing it right now has become very hard. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm getting there. And like you said, you're basically an entrepreneur because you got to do everything. Mm-hmm. And it's a little piece of your time, and it's very hard to say no. I can't talk to you right now, or put the phone away and turn off social media and write. That's my biggest. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie. Facebook is my biggest downfall. Yeah, I'll be like, oh, look, someone said something, and I got ADD, and there I go off down to another rabbit hole I don't need to be going down. But I still think it's an escape. I think reading and writing and any of the music, any of it's always going to be an escape for me, and that's a good thing. I think everyone needs that in life. It's just a different type of escape now. Yeah,
as you said, a controlled escape. So you have a few hours through the wardrobe or down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and then you have to, have your timer and come out at the end of it.
And the meaning is definitely different when you yourself are writing as opposed to just being like the reader,
Yes, it's a totally different experience. And I think any of us that are any type of artists, you leave a piece of yourself in whatever you do. So it kind of makes it hard to sometimes share that because you're so scared of someone taking it the wrong way or rejecting it. But I think it's a good thing, it's cathartic. And if it helps someone else, if my experiences and my work can help someone else escape, then I'm all for it.
Wow. Yeah.
Saying that worries me. What?
Yeah. We've talked about before how writing is therapeutic, and I think also reading is the first sort of form of therapy I think most kids get into. Just reading someone else's experience and being like, oh yeah, that's a very similar experience to what I've had, or I didn't know there was this was a common thing, and you kind of find that commonality through writing or reading rather, and then through writing as well you kind of get your story out there.
I first started an escape back when my mom had breast cancer. That was my she's good. She's
oh, that's great.
Got it really well. It was a really tough couple years, but I was in high school and I rode, and that was great. I loved my horses. But in Maine, when winter hits, unless you get an indoor arena, you're kind of stuck. And so I had a group of friends, and we'd actually RP, and I just write that way. And it was a way for me to not think about everything going on, not be worried, not be scared. I could just lose myself in that, or I'd read Tolkien. That was my huge Tolkien intro. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's your first real escape when you're a kid. If you learn to love to read, you're always going to find a way to at least relax somehow.
Yeah, I definitely know that my kiddies are going to be avid readers, like it or not.
Yeah.
I read The Hobbit to my son last year. He's 11, so I read that to him. I'm a huge Harry Potter buff, and he and I have read those together. I think it's a really important thing, and it's helped him a lot because he has bullying issues at school, or he did before we moved, and that was a way for him to kind of find relatable instances too. Like, oh, this character is going through, something I went through at school today. That really happens? I'm like, yeah, bud, you're not the only one going through this stuff.
Right.
And it was a way for him to realize he's not alone. Yeah. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, that's powerful stuff. So it's a way to
music's the same way, so.
Yeah.
To me.
For sure, yeah, music. I feel like all sort of art forms are therapeutic in some way for the creator as well as the consumer.
Yeah. Exactly. I'll get stuck on DeviantArt, or I have some artists I follow on Instagram that I'm just like, oh my god, like this is amazing. Yeah, I wish I could do stuff like that. I do not have that talent.
Speaking of other talents, though, so you have 6 projects going on. Can you tell us more about what's in the works right now and what we should expect from you in the near future?
Yes, so I have, like we've discussed, the upcoming book for the Manjian Chronicles. I have that outlined. I'm starting to type away at it. Working titles, The Dragon King, but I don't know if I'm going to keep that or not. We'll see. I have the 3rd book to the Veritas series coming out, Aquidus. That I'm hoping to have out in the fall. Then I also have some new ones coming up. I've got a story called Familiar, which will be the first book of the Durago series. Durago means I lead, and that is a witch-based urban, I don't know if I call it urban fantasy, but it's modern. And then I also have, Route 201 I'm doing a follow-up to. Actually, weirdly enough, was a dream I had the other night, and I kind of just started writing it out, and it hit, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess we're doing another one of those, which I had planned on. And then I have another series called Jace. It's a werewolf series. He's another character I've been writing for a very long time, but this is the first time I've actually been able to sit down and put him in a series. And then my last big project is called Runes, and that will be a Viking YA book.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough one, I'm not going to lie. I lost a friend to suicide a couple months ago, and he was known as the Viking. He was an MMA fighter in England, and a cover model artist, and that's actually how I met him. But he became a very good friend, and then sadly, his demons won. So all the profits to that book will be going to Under Your Scars, which is a foundation actually started by Sully Erna of Godsmack. And it's for mental health awareness. So that one, I'm working on it. It's a tough one just because of how emotional it is for me, but I think it's going to be good, and it's a very good, it's a good message, especially right now, I think, with everything everyone's going through and the suicide rates. It's a huge problem right now, and the more people realize they're not on their own, that, this isn't something they have to deal with on their own, I think the better. And I really like this foundation's message, and I think it's got a good leader for it, so that's why I chose it.
Yeah, it's really inspirational when writers and artists kind of link their fantastical worlds and the things that are in their imagination into the real world kind of stuff, and kind of making those parallels really evident.
That's my goal.
Yeah, it brings a bit more light into the dark spaces of human existence.
It gets pretty darn dark, so we need as much light as we can get.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I think on that note, MJ, we're gonna wrap it up. Did you have any other like last remarks before we see you off?
No, I think that was it, and I really appreciate it. I mean, this was awesome. It was a good conversation, and to be included means a lot to me, so I really appreciate you taking me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And let everyone know where we can find you on social media, your sites, and where we can get your books.
My books are on Amazon. If you look me up under authors MJ Vieira, and that's V as in Victor, I-E-I-R-A. I'm also on Facebook as author MJ Vieira, which you can follow me, add me as a friend. Just let me know you heard me through this podcast. I also have a website, which is mjvieradragonsightings.com, and I'll definitely send that one to you because it's kind of long.
Yeah, that's an awesome title.
Yeah, that's my personal website. Trying to think of anything else. I am on Twitter, Vieira_MJ. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not that great at updating that. And I'm also on Instagram, Devil's Paintbrush, which was an old name, but I've just kept it. So
that's pretty cool. I think it's pretty metal sounding.
It is. My uncle actually told me when I was a kid it was the nickname for the machine gun. So I don't know why it just stuck with me, and I went with it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Weird. It's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it could be much worse.
Yeah,
that's kind of the way I remind my husband of that. I'm like, you actually lucked out. I could have been a lot worse.
Yeah. There's so many worse ones out there. Oh,
there really are. I look at some of them, and I'm like, oh.
Oh, man. Okay, well, MJ, thank you so much for coming on to the High Fantasy Podcast. This was such an incredible conversation, and we really enjoyed picking your brain about stuff, and we hope you had a great time as well.
I did. It was awesome, and please keep in touch, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely keep in touch.
Again, thank you, and you have a great evening. Take care.
You too, guys.
Thank you so much.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well. Thanks.